But the 1 year that it was filled was the year 1938, 1939. It was such an overwhelming demand, not beginning with Kristallnacht, actually beginning earlier, after the Anschluss, the German annexation of Austria. It was a tremendous effort by German and Austrian Jews to find a haven anywhere, including the United States. That's the 1 year, because of the international pressure and outcry, the 1 year that the president allowed the quota to be filled. A few months after Kristallnacht, when the infamous refugee ship, the St. Louis, approached America's shore, this question of what would the administration practically be willing to do, this dilemma was vividly placed before the American public and American Jewry, because here was a ship with 930 German refugees hovering right off the coast of Florida, sending desperate telegrams to the White House, please, Mr. President, allow us in. Now, as I said, the quota was filled that year. So it's not as if the president could have simply waved a magic wand and allowed them to be admitted. But that doesn't mean that there were no other options. After all, the world had just witnessed the horrors of Kristallnacht. It was clear what it would mean for Jews to be trapped in Germany, or in this case, to be sent back to Germany. And just because the quota to the mainland U.S. was full, does not mean that that was the only option. This is an image of the U.S. Virgin Islands. As the St. Louis hovered off the coast of Florida, Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., pictured here with the president, the only Jew in FDR's cabinet, he proposed to the Secretary of State, who then discussed it with the president, the idea of allowing the refugees from St. Louis to go temporarily to the Virgin Islands. The proposal was to allow them to enter on tourist visas, which were good for 6 months. Maybe by then it would be safe to go to Germany, back to Germany, or maybe by then another haven could be found. So it was a temporary solution, but it was a way to avoid sending back these 930 Jews to the inferno that Nazi Germany had begun. Morgenthau proposed it to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. He discussed it with the president. Hull came back to Morgenthau. And we have a transcript of these conversations. Morgenthau kept transcripts of all of his telephone conversations, his professional telephone conversations during that era. So we know what actually transpired. Hull came back, Secretary of State Hull came back to Morgenthau and said, sorry, I discussed this with the president, but there's no way we can allow these people in temporarily. Because, he said, in order to qualify for a tourist visa, you had to have a return address, a home address to which you could and would return after the tourist visa expired. And these people don't have a safe place to go back to, so how can we let them in? Ultimate catch-22. We can't let them in because they have no place to go back to, so we're going to send them back to the place where they have nowhere to go. And when FDR turned away the St. Louis, when he said no, and the ship began making its way back across the Atlantic, as far as he knew, it was going back to Nazi Germany. It happens in the end, as we know, that during that voyage back across the Atlantic, 4 European countries agreed to admit the passengers of the St. Louis. England, France, Holland, Belgium. Even then, people realized that going back to other countries on the European continent was not the safest proposition. It was a lot better than going back to Nazi Germany, and to be sure, the passengers on the St. Louis were greatly relieved that they were not returned to Hamburg, but instead were going to be disembarking in those other countries. But of course, as we know, less than a year later, Holland, France, Belgium were overrun by the Germans. The only St. Louis passengers who survived the group were those who went to England. The ones who went to France, Belgium, and Holland were murdered in approximately the same proportion as the rest of the Jews in those countries. I found several interesting things in my research. The first is, it's clear that the next generation of American Jews especially the younger generation, learned a very important lesson. The Soviet Jewry protest movement of the 1960s and 1970s is exactly what, in their minds, in the minds of the activists in that movement, exactly what should have been done by their parents' generation. So let's start with that. The model of Hillel Koch and the Berkson Group, taking out newspaper ads, marching to the White House, lobbying Congress, these were things that American Jewish leaders did not do for Soviet Jewry in the 1950s or 1960s. It was only when a wave of young activists, beginning with the student struggle for Soviet Jewry, began using these kinds of tactics that the whole plight of Soviet Jewry started to become a major issue for the American Jewish community and beyond. I've had the opportunity during the course of my research to interview a number of the early activists for Soviet Jewry in the United States. One of them, by the way, is sitting right here in the front row. Yisrael Winky Meidad was among those with whom I've discussed what was it that drove the young activists of Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, Beitar, and other groups. What drove them to undertake the kind of activism that they did? And often they said to me that their awareness of American Jewish leaders in action during the Holocaust was something that they felt was a kind of a badge of shame for the American Jewish community, and they did not want to repeat that mistake. And many of them knew about the activities of the Berkson Group and did look to Hillel Koch and the Berkson Group as a kind of an inspiration for their own protests. The second group in the American Jewish community that I would say have, to a certain extent, also learned the lessons from that silence are the pro-Israel activists. The idea of having an AIPAC, for example, is something that was unknown in the 1940s. The Berkson Group tried to fill that vacuum, but of course it didn't have the resources or the connections of the major establishment Jewish groups. So although Berkson and his colleagues did their best and did a very impressive job of lobbying in Washington, they were not in a position to do what, for example, Rabbi Wise could have done if the mainstream groups had a full-time functioning Jewish lobby in Washington the way to do the kinds of things that AIPAC and other pro-Israel organizations have done in Washington in our own time. So in those two ways, Soviet Jewry activism, pro-Israel activism, it's clear that there are those who have learned some of the important lessons from the relative apathy of Rabbi Wise and other Jewish leaders during the Holocaust. Still, I think it's also fair to say that there are ways, unfortunately, in which the American Jewish leadership has not changed significantly from that period long ago. Still today, the American Jewish community suffers from, for example, a lack of democracy. The leaders of American Jewish organizations are not elected democratically. This was a problem in Rabbi Wise's era. I alluded earlier to the problem of Wise not being willing to give way to younger, more dynamic leaders who might have been more effective in challenging Roosevelt's Jewish refugee policies. I did mention earlier that I think, in general, that the American Jewish community today would be a lot healthier if it subscribed to the same principles of democracy that American Jews cherish as American citizens. And I will reiterate that because whatever your position might be on any particular issue, what you mentioned, the Iran deal or anything else, for me it all starts with, well, what does the community want? What do average members of synagogues, of community centers, people who are affiliated with different Jewish organizations, what do they want? For me it all starts with that. If American Jews were able to choose their leaders and to choose the leaders who reflected their views, it might not be what many of us would like. It might be. I don't know. But that's what I would like to see, first of all, the democratization of American Jewry, so that instead of a self-appointed leadership of people who think they know best and then speak on behalf of the community whether or not they really represent it, instead of that, we'd have a leadership that genuinely represented the Jewish community, and therefore in its dealings with Congress, the president, whomever, would authentically represent the views of the constituents who they claim to represent.
Mr. Attorney General Mandelblit on the fact that it should not be considered a bribe to be subjected and agreed to favorable publicity. So I agree with you. I think Jews should speak out on that. I think the Israeli press, unfortunately, is one-sided against Netanyahu. And you see in the Israeli press a kind of a mirror image of the American press. I mean, again, if you're an American and you follow what goes on in the United States, the press is against the president. In Israel, the press is against the prime minister. And I agree, those who speak out and are ready to speak out in favor of the prime minister should do so. But I think that's one of the lessons that one learns from what happened in the 1940s and compared with what happened with regard to Soviet Jewry. When the Jews spoke out on Soviet Jewry in the United States, it had an effect. And that, I think, is what my father was calling for in 1940. My father said it in his articles, that the Nazis believed that they were doing the world a favor, that the world would be thankful to the Germans once Hitler succeeded for the fact that they had eradicated this terrible race. And it was important in terms of that to get to them the message from neutral countries, from the United States, from Great Britain, that that was not true. They were not going to be thanked for getting rid of the Jews. They were going to be condemned. If they lost, they were going to prosecute. That message, according to my father, and according to those who were active in terms of rescue, was a message that had to be sent by the United States through the United Nations, which at that point was still considered at the very end as being a respectable voice that would be listened to by the German government. So, sure, it was very, very difficult. And my father's articles say it's very difficult, but nonetheless you have to try. And the problem is that the American Jewish community did not try. And I've said to friends, I don't know really what I should be doing now as a result of the fact that Columbia has become a hotbed of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I mean, it's outrageous. I did send a letter to the president protesting the fact that the prime minister of Malaysia was invited to speak by Columbia. I thought that was outrageous. I think it's outrageous that they're allowing Palestinian professors to intimidate Jewish students on the Columbia campus. And I'm saddened by the fact that the Jewish students who were going to Columbia and Barnard, too many of them, seem to have been won over by the BDS movement. The whole thing is a great tragedy in terms of the United States. I think that it is the obligation of Jews in universities around the United States to speak out and to take the position that this is an outrage of what's going on in the United States. And I hope that they will do that.
Netanyahu went to meet him privately at the Kimberly Hotel in New York, where he was lodging, and was able to persuade him to make one more attempt. As you may have gathered by now, my father had a certain gift of persuasion, so to say. The rally was to take place at the Manhattan Center, I think the largest public hall in New York at the time, maybe even today, I don't know. And Netanyahu took it upon himself to organize the event and raise the necessary funds. What was the planned event's main topic suggested by Netanyahu? It was a call for the creation of a Jewish army that would take part in the fight against Germany, something that Jabotinsky had already been advocating. Germany was, by then, it was at the tail end of its Western onslaught. In fact, on the very day of the rally, June 19, France was negotiating to surrender to Germany. The situation for England and for the world in general, not to mention the Jews, was dire. By this time, England's White Paper of 1939 was already set to policy. It explicitly rejected the idea of a Jewish state, not even the ridiculously truncated state that the British had suggested in 1937, 2 years before. It also severely restricted Jewish purchase of land, even more than before, and allowed only minuscule Jewish immigration to the country, this at the very time when the Jews of Europe sorely needed a place of refuge. The aim that was stated was that the Jews in Palestine would forever remain a minority, which with time would shrink. Despite this harsh anti-Zionist stand by Britain, Jabotinsky felt that now, in view of the critical military situation England was facing, there was a reasonable chance that the British government, with Churchill as the new Prime Minister, would agree. Churchill, by the way, was a known pro-Zionist, would agree to the idea of a Jewish army, especially if the demand was strongly supported by America, on whose financial aid and logistical support England was now totally dependent. Really, England was at the hands of America at that time. Besides its own merits in furthering the Zionist cause, the Jewish army call was considered by my father and the delegation to be a tool to stir public discussion about Zionism in general. It would serve as a means to arouse the Jews of America to support Zionism and the revisionist ideas, including the acute need to put strong pressure on England to reverse its anti-Jewish policy and to allow all Jews who wanted to leave Europe to come to Palestine. Something that Germany at that time would not necessarily have been against. Speaking at the Manhattan Center, Jabotinsky demanded the creation of a Jewish army not merely as a force within the British Army, as was the case in World War I, but as an independent army, and a large one at that. The British colonial and foreign offices and their ministers, of course, were naturally very much against this idea, because they knew very well that it would be used by the Zionists to agitate for renewed English and international support of their cause. The gathering, to which every ticket was sold at a high price, by the way, was a success. Both in the days preceding the rally and afterwards, there was much discussion in the press about the event and the issues raised there. So further rallies were planned in cities with large Jewish populations. But tragically, on August 4, 1940, Jabotinsky died at the age of 60. Throughout the yeshiva, my father deliberated with himself what to do. After having worked with him for 4 months now, he felt, for various reasons that we will not get into here, that very little would be accomplished by the delegation as it was, and so decided to resign from it and make his way back home to Eretz Israel. But that turned out to be not feasible.
What I looked at Begin, realizing he had on the field, on the ground, experience, what does he do? So, in an article that appeared on February 1st, 1943, entitled, "Yes, Rescue is Possible," all right? He writes, only one thing is not done in terms of what is not being done. No real war is waged for the right of the Jews to their homeland. Is a rescue still possible? Is it not too late? It is surely possible. The Jews of Bulgaria, Hungary, and what is left of remaining Jews are begging to be saved. In other words, obviously in 1943, February 43, Begin is aware of what's going on. You could claim that maybe some leaders of American Jewry or other Jewry simply were not well informed enough. Or that even if they weren't well informed, like Stephen Wise at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall of 42, maybe did not, the Hebrew word is to digest, right? Digest the news and realize exactly what was going on, even though anybody who had any, we mentioned Jabotinsky several times, anybody who opens up Jabotinsky's book, The War on the Jew, that was published in 1940, can see lists of thousands of Jews being killed in Poland. Maybe not consciously realizing that there's a mass extermination, but there's death, there's murder, there's some sort of campaign against the Jews. The revolt that was proclaimed a year later, February 1st, 1944, significantly mentions the Holocaust, significantly mentions that Jews are dying. Okay? He mentions the Patria, the Struma. During the 4 years of war, millions of our best people have been lost. More millions are in danger of extermination, and the land of Israel is tightly closed. As a result of that, he declares there is no longer an armistice between the Jewish people and youth and the British administration in Eretz Yisrael. So, my question is, does the published material we have between 44 and at least 48, not talking about later, indicate a reactive expression to the failure of Jewish leaders during the Holocaust? What Begin does, and I'm afraid I will run out of time, so I'm going to bring my conclusion a little bit up a little bit. Begin, as much as you might not expect, basically adopts a fatalistic stance. He says that they are going to die because I'm looking around and I see no one helping them. Not American Jews, not European, not English Jews, not the world, the non-Jewish world. So he basically says, if there is a chance to rescue, it must be establishing a state of Israel as quickly as possible. Because looking around and happening to know what Begin read newspapers, he was one to listen to the BBC every day, he was very well informed as much as possible. He looked around and said, well, this is Galut, diaspora Jewry going the way Herzl and Jabotinsky promised would happen. If I'm echoing a little bit what Ido said before, in a certain sense, he says, we can't expect anything more. We have no expectations from the Goy, from the non-Jew. It's up to us.